Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Bosnia is facing what is arguably its deepest political crisis since the Civil War in the 1990s. This war saw the worst fighting in Europe since World War II, with around 100,000 people killed, 2 million people displaced, many atrocity crimes committed, including the crime of genocide. In 1995, the United States helped broker an agreement between the warring parties known as the Dayton Accords. This agreement created a new political order in Bosnia and Herzegovina by essentially dividing the country into two parts: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is majority Bosniak Muslim and Croat, and the Republika Srpska, which is majority Serb. These two entities combine to form an internationally recognized government, which is led by a rotating three-member presidency, which includes a Bosniak, a Serb, and a Croat. And layered on top of this is an international diplomat known as the High Representative, who wields some power. This has been the basic agreement that has prevented a return to armed conflict. It has been an uneasy agreement, certainly tenuous at times, but it has held since 1995. But now this is all unraveling, and very quickly, because the political leadership in Republika Srpska seems determined to secede. On the line to explain why and how Bosnia is on the verge of potential political disintegration is Jasmin Mujanovic, a political scientist and analyst of Southeast European and international affairs. We recorded our conversation live via Twitter Spaces, and I've noticed that since I've started recording these conversations live, we've had many more listeners to the podcast itself. If you are a new listener to the show, welcome. Please be sure to follow or subscribe to the podcast feed. Doing so will unlock hundreds and hundreds of episodes that I've posted over the years. Global Dispatches is the longest running independent international affairs podcast. I've been doing this since like 2012, 2013. Subscribing to the feed will unlock access to this very robust archive. If you are a returning listener, thank you for keeping on listening to the show. Please leave a comment or a review of the podcast at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And as always, feel free to reach out to me at Mark L. Goldberg on Twitter or by using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love for you to suggest to me topics I should cover or people I should interview. Thank you. All right, now here is my conversation with Jasmin Mujanovic.
Let me just quickly sort of address what I wanted to say right off the bat, because I think it is important, actually, and I'm not just being pedantic. So first of all, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was not a civil war, just like the war in Ukraine today is not a civil war, right? The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina certainly featured aspects of what we would in the academic literature refer to as a civil war or a civil conflict, but Bosnia and Herzegovina was invaded by the then government of Serbia under Slobodan Milosevic, and for a brief period also de facto by the government of Croatia under Franjo Tudjman, right? Just like today, Ukraine is under occupation by the Russian Federation. That's number one. Number two is that Bosnia and Herzegovina was not created at the Dayton Peace Accords. Bosnia and Herzegovina joined the United Nations in 1992 as a sovereign and independent state. What the Dayton Accords did very significantly was that they helped usher in peace, and they reformulated Bosnia's existing constitution. And you're absolutely right, though, that this current moment that we find ourselves in is arguably the most significant structural, political, and ultimately also constitutional crisis that the country finds itself in. These are the most credible threats of secession and disintegration that the country has faced since 1995. And also, I think what's very, very alarming is that there is a kind of geopolitical component to everything that the Serb nationalist leadership in the RS entity is presently engaging in, again, backed by the government of Serbia, but also increasingly Russia, and also even to some extent elements within the Euro-Atlantic community community like Hungary.
So let's dive right into it. And thank you for your more accurate representation of my introduction. I do appreciate it. So look, why? So this crisis has been sparked by recent separatist moves by that RS entity, Republika Srpska. I take it there has been this undercurrent of separatism and Serb nationalism in Republika Srpska for a long time. Why is this accelerating right now? Like, what's happening?
So I think it's a good question, and there's the official line, by which I mean the reasoning that the leadership in the RS, primarily Mr. Dodik, have offered.
And then Dodik is the head of Republika Srpska, who serves as one of those three head entities in BIH.
Right. So he's technically right now a member of the tripartite state presidency. He's the ethnic Serb member of the presidency who is elected from the territory of the RS. Technically speaking, he actually functionally doesn't have a position in the Republika Srpska right now. But because he has, over the span of 16 years, basically turned that entity into a private fiefdom, that's a completely kind of symbolic reality, right? Just like when, for instance, Mr. Medvedev was nominally the president of the Russian Federation, it was widely understood that Mr. Putin ran the whole country just like he had before. So it's the same thing with Dodik. He doesn't technically have a function in the Republika Srpska entity right now, but he is the guy in charge. So the official reasoning for this current secession crisis is that over the summer, the outgoing high representative, as you explained, the highest representative, theoretically speaking, of the international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, an Austrian by the name of Valentin Inzko, imposed a so-called anti-genocide denial law, which criminalizes not just negating the facts of the genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also more broadly any internationally recognized war crimes or crimes against humanity, including things like the Holocaust. Right? The Bosnian parliament had attempted to pass this law itself for many, many years, but it was systematically obstructed, above all by Mr. Dodik's SNSD party in the Bosnian parliament, and also frequently these obstruction activities were backed by their close coalition partners in the Croat nationalist HDZ party. So Mr. Inzko felt that because genocide denial had become really systemic, vulgar, gratuitous, the government of the RS was literally spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every year peddling and promoting genocide denial, negationism, revisionism, including these kind of bogus supposed international committees. As his outgoing act, he imposed this anti-genocide law and said, as his successor, the German Christian Schmidt, has said, this should actually be an incentive to the Bosnian parliament to create their own law. Well, Mr. Dodik said, basically, he doesn't want to go through the institutions of the Bosnian parliament. He doesn't want to pass this law in any capacity. So he has begun creating parallel institutions. Now, what's important to understand is that although it is certainly the case that genocide denial and genocide glorification is a very, very important feature of the kind of ideological posture and activities of Mr. Dodik's regime, the kind of structural long-term goal, though, is the breakup of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so ultimately, Mr. Dodik has only used this genocide law, anti-genocide denial law, to initiate what he has been preparing the ground for, arguably since 2006, but very, very earnestly since 2014, in and around the invasion of Ukraine, actually, by Russia, which is to say, again, initiating formal secession procedures in Bosnia and Herzegovina to attempt to take the RS entity out of the country.
So it was this genocide law that was like the proximate spark, but this had been brewing for a long time.
Right.
Like, I mean, are there broader geopolitical forces that are enabling this move to happen now, whereas it couldn't have happened, say, a few years ago over like another made-up proximate cause?
So it's certainly the case that Mr. Dodik presently enjoys a tremendous amount of international backing from a kind of configuration and axis, if you will, of certain international authoritarian and illiberal states. His most important benefactors are the government of Aleksandar Vučić in Serbia, and of course the regime in the Kremlin. Those are his two most significant backers. Increasingly, however, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, he has begun receiving a very significant degree of at least diplomatic and it appears now potentially also financial support from governments like Hungary. He has also made deep inroads with the government of China and is keen to bring the Chinese on board with his secessionist activities. And also he has made surprising overtures, surprising perhaps to people who have not followed the Balkans for maybe since the wars of the 90s, but unfortunately less so for those of us who keep abreast of local events. But he has made actually pretty strong overtures to the government in Zagreb and in Croatia. And that's a pretty complicated dynamic to explain, but suffice it to say that the very close relationship that he has with Croat nationalist actors in Bosnia and Herzegovina is one that he has also begun essentially replicating at the international stage, which is to say enjoying a certain kind of political, at least protection or plausible deniability from certain elements of the both the president of Croatia and to some extent also the government of Croatia, headed by by Prime Minister Andrej Plenković.
So, is it the ultimate goal of Dodik to have Republika Srpska join Serbia? And does the Serbian government even sort of want that headache that would cause internationally?
So it is the case that Mr. Dodik has a long-term vision, and the vision is of essentially what we in the 90s would have referred to as the idea of a greater Serbia. The government in Serbia has a different name for this project. The term that Mr. Aleksandar Vulin, who's the current Minister of the Interior, but up until very recently was the Minister of Defense and is one of the closest people to Aleksandar Vučić, one of his closest associates. He refers to this as the idea of the Serbian world, which is a concept that they're directly borrowing from the Russians, the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. It's also, again, as I said, liberally borrowing from Slobodan Milosevic's Greater Serbia concept, right? So it's this idea that the future of the Western Balkans will see the creation of a much greater and greatly expanded Serbian state, which will see the so-called unification of all ethnic Serbs in the Western Balkans. That primarily means the annexation and occupation of Eastern Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is to say the RS entity. These people also believe that they will eventually bring Montenegro back into some kind of union with Serbia. It also means that they believe that they will take over, if not the entirety of the sovereign state of Kosovo, then certainly those ethnic Serb majority areas north of the Iber River in around Mitrovica, that they will bring those into Serbia proper. And in the most extremist versions of this fantasy, there's also sometimes speculation about potentially taking parts of North Macedonia and even Croatia. So it's a fantastical ultra nationalist vision.
Well,
I
was alive in the 90s. I remember that movie. It did not end well.
Yeah. So nobody was hoping for a sequel, but here we are.
So what would be like the mechanism by which Republika Srpska actually starts its like process of removing itself, disintegrating, separating itself from Bosnia and Herzegovina? Is there, I know, as you said earlier, they're creating some like separate state structures, but is there like a potential like just declaration of independence followed by potential fighting? Like how, I guess my first question is like, what would be the steps that one might expect should Dodik act on these statements that Republika Srpska will indeed declare independence and separate itself, followed by like, what is the potential that armed conflict may result from it?
So, as you noted, they've already begun the kind of quasi-legal. I mean, they use the term legal very loosely in the sense that all of this is obviously unconstitutional and illegal, but they're trying to create the legal veneer of a process for creating a parallel legal infrastructure or structure, I should say, for declaring independence somewhere down the road. And they have these kind of somewhat fluid timelines. They're always kind of doing these resolutions that they say they will then enact 6 months later. So we're in the midst of one of these kind of moments right now, and we're unclear what's going to happen in about 5 months from now.
Can I just stop you? Like, what's an example of like a parallel structure?
So, for instance, the first structure that they went about creating was a drug, which sounds very sort of banal and blasé and not particularly dangerous. But the first thing that they did was that they created a drug acquisition agency, right? So, like a government agency for the creation of drugs and medical supplies. The issue is that there already is such an agency at the Bosnian state level, and so the government of the RS created a law that said that they were going to initiate the creation of their own agency without actually going through the necessary legal process at the Bosnian state level and through the Bosnian parliament to spin this body off, right? You can't just create a parallel institution. This is like basic constitutional procedure. Yeah. But this is the thing that they're trying to do, right? So they're trying to basically say all of these things that exist at the state level, we are, as they put it, quote unquote, pulling out of, which is not actually a legal thing that exists. And we are then going to create our own essentially shadow institutions. So they've said they're going to pull out of the tax authority, they're going to pull out of the armed forces, the border police, the constitutional court, and all kinds of other institutions, and that they're going to create their own institutions that do the same thing at the entity level, which is not how the world works, but that is the project, which is why myself and others have referred to this as a process of secession in all but name, which is to say they are now a little bit careful to not say secession, but it's very clear that this is kind of the institutional mechanism with which you would go about seceding.
What about security forces? Are they in the process, or has Republika Srpska started to, disassociate itself with like any common security arrangements or security forces?
Right. So at this point, I would just remind all of the listeners that you also have to appreciate that Bosnia and Herzegovina is arguably already the most decentralized state in the world, right? So you have to understand that when we're saying that they're creating parallel institutions, it really beggars belief because it's difficult to imagine that Bosnia could be any more decentralized than it is, while still remaining a single sovereign state. And that's exactly what Dodik is trying to get at, right? He's trying to push it to the next sort of mile, as it were, and that mile functionally means the dissolution of the country. Now, as far as security arrangements are concerned, Mr. Dodik has said that he does want to pull out of the armed forces, the unified armed forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but the RS entity does already have its own police, and over the last 10 years or so, but very aggressively over the last 6 or 7 years, the RS police has undergone a very, very significant, what I would call paramilitarization, which is to say they look less and less like a civilian police force and more like an armed militia. So for those who, for instance, saw some of the scenes out of the regional capital, it's actually not the regional capital, I should say, but whatever, Banja Luka, they had this unconstitutional ceremony marking the attempted secession of this territory in 1992 under the leadership of genocidaire Radovan Karadzic. So they had this big parade and they had all these people out, and you saw these cordons of anti-terrorism police. When you saw those police, it's very, very clear that they looked like a military rather than a police. And so this is the fear that they already in some ways have at least some of the, shall we say, practical capacities to at the very least create some very serious security incidents in Bosnia.
So it also seems that in addition to this, like kind of creating these parallel bureaucratic structures, there has been this sharp increase in like nationalist, racist rhetoric as well. As you just alluded to, there was this incident just a few days ago in which there was a celebration that was apparently banned that many people who are not Serb nationalists found to be particularly disturbing because it harkened back to like the worst of the early 1990s. Can you just maybe briefly explain or describe the tenor right now in Republika Srpska coming from those separatist leaders?
So I think, and I will be so bold as to say that this is a kind of, shall we say, cross-ethnic phenomenon in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think all decent people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I would say even the region, are really horrified by the events of the weekend. And this includes people in Serbia, in Montenegro, in Croatia, everyone who saw this, what was going on during this weekend, because this really is the kind of most sinister, horrifying cosplay of the lead up to the war in the 1990s and the genocide. The significance of the January 9th date is that it really marks the formal institutional onset of the Bosnian genocide, and the creation of these parallel breakaway structures by the then regime of Radovan Karadzic and his underlings Ratko Mladic and others, and backed by Slobodan Milosevic. So there's no way to separate January 9th from the Bosnian genocide. And, I've got into much more detail on my Twitter, so people can kind of go there if they're interested in that. And a number of people have really written beautiful things on the I use the term beautiful, but beautiful, powerful writing on a really horrible event. And it's just to say that it's difficult. It's really difficult on a deeply personal and emotional level to explain the horror of seeing people celebrate and sing and set off fireworks and parade and march and bring their children to attend an event that commemorates, or not commemorates, but celebrates the onset of a genocide. On my Twitter, I compared it essentially to, lynching postcards from the American South during the worst of the Jim Crow and post-Civil War era. But it's that on a kind of mass government-sponsored level. So the sheer the sheer horror and the terror of it, I think, is very difficult to perhaps convey to people who did not live through those experiences or don't have those experiences in their family narratives. But I would hope that on a basic moral and an ethical level, people would realize why this is so upsetting and why it's so frightening to not just people in Bosnia, but throughout the region.
And it sort of speaks again to why I sort of frame this as just being a very perilous moment. I mean, you have inflamed nationalist sentiments combined with a leader who has long wanted to separate Republika Srpska from the rest of Bosnia, combined by a more favorable geopolitical environment right now that could enable this to actually happen. So to what extent are you concerned that this moment might lead to some sort of armed conflict, albeit maybe not on the scale of the 1990s, but some sort of guns firing?
So I think what keeps me up at night is the fact that I think it's more likely today than it has been at any point since the end of the war. Now, I don't want to put numbers, percentages as to how likely I think it is, but the room for miscalculation has become enormous. And while I don't think that Mr. Dodik is a stupid man, and I don't think he is I don't think he is irrational, as it were. I do think that the ideas that he subscribes to, and the kind of power that he has, is a certain kind of narcotic and a certain kind of toxin. And I do think that there is the possibility that he has so convinced himself and is so surrounded by true believers, and it does genuinely appear that he is, that he believes that he could concoct some kind of security incident, and that he would expect that his friends in Belgrade and Moscow and perhaps other places would come to his aid, because he knows also that any kind of serious security crisis that would stay genuinely within the parameters of the Bosnian state and would not see any kind of meaningful outside interference, that, shall we say, skirmish, that clash, would not go well for Mr. Dodik, because as fragmented as the Bosnian security apparatus is, it does have enough residual force to deal with somebody like Mr. Dodik and his breakaway leadership, as it were. The fear is that it would not remain contained within Bosnia, that you would see some kind of hybrid or clandestine interference on the part of the government of Serbia, on the part of the Russian Federation, and perhaps still other actors. And at that point, we would have not just a fundamental breakdown, obviously, of the Dayton Peace Accords. We would have another very, very serious security crisis in Europe, in addition to everything that's already going on in Ukraine. And I genuinely don't know that whatever remains of the legitimacy or the credibility, in particular, of the European Union, could sustain such another blow.
So, given how perilous and precarious the situation is right now, what are you seeing on the international level diplomatically from the European Union, which, as you just said, is directly threatened by the potential disintegration of Bosnia? Like, what is the EU doing right now to potentially de-escalate this situation?
I think, unfortunately, the EU as a body is not doing very much at all, if anything. That is a, shall we say, institutional reality. The EU is a fundamentally consensus-based decision-making body, and when you have people like Viktor Orban and Janez Janša essentially determining the sway of regional foreign policy, it's very difficult to imagine that there's going to be any kind of meaningful response to the situation in Bosnia. It should also be said, unfortunately, that people like Dodik and people like Orban and Janez Janša and others and other illiberal elements in the EU have done a tremendous job of corroding and corrupting the internal operations of the European Union. I mean, as a colleague, or rather as an MEP in Brussels put it to me a couple of weeks ago, we're seeing elements of state capture within the European Union. And so, one of the hopes, obviously, for instance, was that we would see sanctions on the part of the European Union against Mr. Dodik and his government. That obviously will not happen. And so now the hope is that individual European Union capitals, in particular places like Berlin, the government of the Netherlands, and perhaps still others, would be willing to impose unilateral sanctions like the United States has done just a few days ago, or rather imposed expanded sanctions on Mr. Dodik and some of his associates. We're still waiting, unfortunately, on that. I believe, and I'm very hopeful, that the United Kingdom will come through. The UK has emerged as really one of the most constructive and important backers of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, it would be tremendous if we could see a very significant and sustained kind of Anglo-American engagement in Bosnia and Herzegovina come out of this situation. But ideally, we would also see some of our European friends, shall we say, actually put their money where their mouth is.
And how relevant is the United States as a player able to make diplomatic waves in this region? I did see that the Treasury Department did slap some sanctions on Dodik last week or earlier this week even. What role is the United States playing?
Well, look, I mean, the United States was the architect of the Dayton Peace Accords. It is, in that sense, kind of the primary legal and international guarantor of the country's constitutional order and thus the country's peace and security. There was a lot of hope, I think, by a lot of Bosnians and Herzegovinians about the Biden administration because President Biden is an old Bosnia hand. He was really very much on the right side of history during the Bosnian War and the Bosnian genocide. He was very critical of the Clinton administration, slow walking its involvement in the Bosnian conflict. The reality is this administration has also been faced by a tremendous number of other crises that it's been dealing with. So I think to date, that hope about the level and the quality, shall we say, of American engagement in Bosnia has not really been borne out in reality. The sanctions that were imposed a couple of days ago are really, really very important and are commendable. It's going to be very important that those sanctions be expanded to other members of Mr. Dodik's regime. And it's also going to be very, very important that the United States uses its leverage and its power to work with its other Atlantic allies to broaden the depth and the scope of this regime. Because unfortunately, I think if it remains isolated to the United States, the impact won't be as great unless the United States then is willing to take an additional step, which is to say to really radically deepen the tenure of the sanctions, basically modeling them on something like the Iran sanctions that would then effectively tie the hands of European financial institutions and companies and governments in terms of any kind of financial or economic dealings with the regime in Banja Luka. But I think that is unlikely at this juncture.
Lastly, in the coming days or weeks or even months, are there any inflection points or key decisions that you'll be looking towards that will suggest to you how this situation will unfold?
So I think the next big marker to watch out for is whether or not Mr. Dodik and Mr. Dragančović, who's the leader of the Croat nationalist HDZ party that I was mentioning earlier, whether they're going to try to make a serious play at basically scuttling the holding of the next general elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which are slated for October. They effectively already did this once, sort of semi-successfully. So during the last so-called municipal or local elections in 2018, they managed to delay those elections by about a month and a half, 2 months, by holding the funding hostage. Both Mr. Čović and Mr. Dodik have made all kinds of threats and hints, dropped all kinds of hints that they're willing to do this. I think if they do this and if they make a hard play at it, it would be a very, very dangerous situation. And it would also be, again, another very, very serious test of the credibility, in particular of the European Union and individual European Union governments as to their commitments to peace and security, not just in Bosnia, but the whole of the Western Balkans. I think a lot of attention, in particular at this moment, needs to fall on Berlin and to see whether the new government in Germany is willing to take a more constructive approach to Bosnia than, unfortunately, the previous government did, or rather did not.
Well, Jasmin, thank you so much for your time. This is very helpful.
For sure. Thank you for the platform.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Jasmin Mujanovic for speaking with me. We had about 650 people listening live. I think about a few thousand people kind of came and went, but about 650 people stuck through the whole thing. And after I finished chatting with Jasmin, he graciously stuck around to take questions from the audience. As always, just follow me on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg to be alerted of when these conversations go live. All right, thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Bye.